Here we go. So welcome everyone to enabling the time. I'm sorry. Welcome everyone to another Global Asia Colloquium. The second or third of the semester, we have a whole series lined up, and I recommend everyone to go to the website and see our schedule. It's a pretty interesting schedule of things. I actually do want to call attention to one more thing. The very next one, I believe, is on November 9th, Imperial Aftermath, Refugees, Reckonings, and Resurgences, which we're doing jointly with the Asian and Pacific American Institute at NYU. So it's going to be a really interesting feature of our contribution to our project on global Asia. So in any case, today we have a really exciting panel that is led by May Joseph and Sudipto Sen, who have put together a really important, interesting collection of people and of topics and based on a book that was edited by Dilip Menon and his colleagues called Ocean as Method, Thinking with the Maritime. And there are the page proofs are available for people and we're going to have a discussion of the book and the subject and a larger exploration of the thematic and the methodological elements involved in it. And so we have a panel that consists of Dilip Menon, who's professor of history in the Department of International Relations and the director of the Center of Indian Studies in Africa at Witwatersrand in South Africa. Renisa Mawani, who's associate professor of sociology and founding chair of the Law and Society minor program at the University of British Columbia. Isabel Hofmeyr, sometimes colleague here, visiting to New York City from Witwatersrand, is a professor emeritus at the University of Witwatersrand and a distinguished scholar in residence at NYU. And May Joseph is the founder of Harmattan Theater and professor of social science at Pratt Institute. And she and Sudipto Sen, who is professor of history and Middle East South Asian studies at University of California, Davis, have gotten together and schemed to get all this thing to work. And so I pass this to them now to get the whole thing rolling. And welcome to everyone. And I look forward to a wonderful conversation. Just one little note on our sort of methodology here. The panel will interact and make presentations for an hour or so. Then we'll have a Q&A. It'll be open for everyone to participate. And I would say that when we're doing the Q&A, rather than having people use the chat, I would request everyone to use the hand raising function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. And so that way we'll be able to call people in the order of their raising their hands, and we'll be able to see people faces and hear them talk when they ask their questions. More detail, of course, on all the participants and more material on the subject matter are available on the website here. And Jenny's going to put the link to this website in the chat. So there'll be lots more available information for our programs on this website. And away we go. May.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everybody, for joining our session. It's a great privilege to be here. And I want to thank Jenny Chang and David for helping Sudipto and I create this symposium thematic session called Port City Environments, Anthropocene, Ecologies, and Climate Futures Project. And this colloquium is coming out of the IPCC reports of this February that really spurred us to respond to it in some way. The 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has emphasized the unequal burdens that the Global South faces in the unfolding climate crisis. Extreme heat and storm surges already inundate much of coastal Asia. Embracing Dilip Menon's observation that the world has always been an archipelagic entity with multiple intersecting visions of the globe, We begin with an investigation into the idea of the ocean as method. Key voices from the Global South have opened up approaches to this broader historical question. The work of Dilip Menon, Isabel Hofmeyr, and Renisa Mawani have been incubators of a conjunctural approach to the study of the maritime across the world's oceans, particularly the Pacific and Indian Ocean. The largest agglomeration of low-lying islands and archipelagos are situated across the hemispheric south from the Indian Ocean to the South China Seas, enveloping some of the densest sinking port cities in the world. And here I see Jerome Whittington's joined us, and his book is one of those really critical contributions to this conversation. This opening colloquium begins a series of inquiries into the historical and contemporary connectivities that shape the floating populations of those who, as Dilip Menon describes, walk on water. So I look forward to this really rare chance to hear some of the founding conceptualizers of the oceanist method approach, which was, for me, was Isabel Hofmeyr, Dilip, and Renisa's books. And so I'm going to hand over to my co-moderators, Sudipto Sen, who's professor of history at UC Davis, and his book, Ganges, The Many Paths of an Indian River, was really the inspiration for me to do, to create a collaboration with him, which was Terra Aqua, which came out this month. But I just want to say that the Ganges book as well is part of this bigger thinking, along with Sunil Amrit's book on the Bay of Bengal, about how do we think of the oceanist method. So thank you, and I hand off to Sudipta.
Thank you so much, May. And it's just such a pleasure to see all of you, and especially meet up with very old friends and people that I have come across my various journeys, academic and otherwise. Obviously, the immediate concern is, of course, what does the Anthropocene do to oceanic methodologies in our times, and sort of then what kind of pressure it puts on the way we look at past crossings, across various bodies of water. So I will leave that for now, that general optic, and delve right into a set of very fascinating questions, which Dilip and his colleagues have put together in this wonderful book of essays. Now, I begin with Marcus Rediker's well-known provocation that a true maritime method is an indispensable vantage point if we are to dispel in any serious way what he called terracentric history. So the oceans are not, therefore, liquid anonymities placed between the shores of nation states, but in fact, essential crucibles of history, some of it very difficult history, for instance, of slavery, the plantation economy, of imperialism, of gunboats, the rise and inundation of industrial and global capital, the history of the unjust and unequal give and take of global commodities, of labor, of convict bodies, of the upheavals and concatenations of race, creolization, and métissage. Some of this history is still emerging as we speak. There is obviously a longer, larger genealogy of the idea of ocean as method. Method, very simply, how do we do what we do with the ocean as scholars, as historians, anthropologists, climate students. But here especially, the connectedness of the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean here holds a place which is very different, which is that I think this collection of essays is questioning the very metageography of oceanic names. And those names are actually products of historical parsing and geopolitical realities that need to be questioned and pushed back against. So the Indian Ocean, in this case, ideas that come from older conversations among friends, colleagues, interlocutors, many of us have in common, Antoinette Burton, who wrote about Indian Ocean as Method in History Compass, joined by Madhavi Kale, and informed, especially in the case of May and myself, by a new reading, if you like, of Sunil Amrit's foundational evocative work on the Bay of Bengal as a much-peopled ocean or a much-peopled seas, a labyrinth of maritime highways between India and China, reconfigured by steamships and gunboats of empire, witness to the uprooting and resettling of peoples, connecting distant hinterlands, shaping the future, as it were, of climate change, imperiling fragile ecologies, and unleashing new forces of nation and nationness and geopolitical tensions, which we are living with in that region. Now, in this collection of essays put together by Dilip Menon, Nishad Zaidi, Simi Malhotra, and Sarah Jappi, the idea of oceanic space-time as a kind of powerful solvent of earthbound histories and its implicit geographical liquid praxis is very provocative, very inspiring. It propels us towards new and more productive ways of inquiry, of which we hope to hear more about from today from our speakers. I would like to add to this set of considerations the question of how our own recalibration of maritime histories in the shadow of the long Anthropocene, as already outlined by May, might further complicate. And by the way, this word complicate comes obviously through Isabel Hofmeyr's, and I'm going to come to that in a second, further complicates or indeed forces us to reaggregate the various ocean-bound histories of the long depletion of our planet's habitability and the convergence of those histories, perhaps to use an unsightly image, maybe like the histories that converge on a floating island of plastic. And now, about a decade ago, Isabel Hofmeyr laid out a set of fascinating conceptual tools to complicate the notion of the Indian Ocean as a historical backdrop, helping us recenter it as a key dynamic element in a crucial restaging of world history and the history of the global South, not to mention the history of Asia and Africa, where the waters of global Africa and global Asia meet, so to speak, redefined in their immensely generative universality, a site of plural geographical and historical imaginaries, an invitation to reconsider its open-ended spatiality. And the examples that she laid out, and I'm going to use a particular phrase that I found very, very useful and productive. The history of the Indian Ocean trade networks, a quote, rooted in a grammar of monsoons and trade winds, port cities and littorals, ships and seafaring, religion and commerce. This grammar is an unsettled grammar with a lot of dialects, with a lot of demotic sort of inlets, as it were. And this is something that comes up in this volume of, the multiplicity and the plenitude of this kind of thinking. And not to mention the history of the great unfolding along the Cape and the littoral in South Africa of histories tied to plantations and mining that redefine the parameters of the imperial and global economy of finance capital. It's a history that gave us the concentration camp, gave us Gandhi and the Hind Swaraj, and gave us the labor regimes of the apartheid, and not in the least the vast conduit and repositories of trans-Anglophone literatures and print cultures. We also have with us my friend Renisa Mawani, whose fascinating and wonderful book, Across the Oceans of Law, shows in brilliant detail how we can reconnect the differently named oceans, Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, into the same passages of history, asking us to reimagine a paradigm of ocean as a different kind of method, in this case, the method that comes also through law, a crisscrossing of permissible and forbidden voyages, sometimes out of desperation of Indian travelers, with or without their express volition, whose histories joined inevitably the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, and then obviously also to the Atlantic. How the various contingencies of national imperial law fell upon the story of the movement of bodies between different shores. And the case of Komagata Maru, the amazing paradox of this continuous journey, fueled by the fear of uprising, of Ghadar, fueled by a sort of littoral xenophobias, creating the reductio ad absurdum of a ship and of bodies that have no port of call, sort of outside of the frames of both imperial and national histories. It's a great provocation that sort of forces us to think more about the history from so the bottom up of the ocean. And then I turn from there to Dilip Menon's introductory essay. I will take 2 more minutes of your time, which is, I think, a fitting capstone to these forays, helping us think beyond the inevitable grasp of the nation state and global history driven by national constellations, the consequential foreclosure of various possibilities of Afro-Asian transnational solidarities, and not just those articulated or maybe sort of cut short at the Bandung Conference, although that is a very good place to start. Dilip dares us to reconsider the conflicted cosmopolitanisms of the recently ruled, the recently colonized, demonstrating once more how oceanic histories complicate the temporalities, the time scales of globalization. I found particularly evocative the image of older shipping routes connecting the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant through the Bab el-Mandeb. Just to remind those of you, I'm sure you know this, the word Bab is the beginning of a chapter. In Arabic and Farsi, also Bab is gate, gates, and how old gates were closed and new gates were opened, including the Suez. And how older forms of geohistorical reckonings have been occluded sometimes in our meta-geographies and meta-histories. Sometimes we too are swept away by the endpoints of demiurgic forces such as the Anthropocene and Anthropocene time, as new visions of flooded coasts and waterborne landscapes cloud or crowd our imaginaries, juxtaposing new figures of the migrant and the refugee, where the victims and the people uprooted by climate change come up against the harsh rationalities of older geopolitical post-imperial borders. In fact, this theme of incompatible histories resonates forcefully through this entire collection of essays. And I hope Dilip can tell us a little bit more about how they work together and how individual authors have contributed to that idea. And I'm going to end with what I find particularly provocative, which is Dilip Menon's rendition of the colonial also as a marker of time, the trinity of pre-colonial and post, which, as he rightly points out, has compounded the myopia of nation-bound area studies to the detriment of other, less visible, affinal geographies, or the hidden lattices of migration and diasporas, of the underground diachronies of parallel and cross-cutting histories and journeys, including stories forgotten of dispossession, severance, indentures, split families and labor, that complicates the grammar. And again, I'm using Professor Hofmeyr's notion of grammar in a different way of geography and topography. And the metaphor, of course, of walking anew over this many-faceted history, or shall we say, wading into its murky and in some ways welcome spatiotemporal depths, gives us this latitude and the ability to rethink this entire history and this entire geography of liquid vastness, to quote other authors. So I end with that idea of complicating something much larger through this something which is also much smaller, and keeping in mind the ironies, as it were, of scale. Thank you. So, May, do you want to sort of time keep a little bit here and tell us what's happening next?
Sure. Well, it'd be wonderful. Thank you so much, Sudipta. And we'd like to launch in. Dilip, please lead the way. If you would like to take 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then followed by Renisa and Isabel, that would be great. Each of you 15 minutes. Dilip, of course, if you want to take a little longer, but we are cognizant of the time, and 1:30 we are going to have to stop. So appreciate everyone just sort of keeping an eye on the clock. Appreciate it. Okay, jump in. Thank you.
Good evening from my end, and thank you so much, May and David, for organizing this. And it's good to be on this panel, along with people whose work has influenced me deeply, particularly Isabel, who set us all down this path more than 2 decades ago, and Renisa's wonderful book, Across the Oceans of Law, which Sudipto mentioned, which has been crucial to my thinking of the ocean. So in one sense, I'm surfing here. I'm surfing the waves that have already existed. So what I want to do is briefly tell you something about this project out of which this book came. I'm at the University of Witwatersrand. We entered into an agreement with the Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi through the Ministry of Human Resources and Development. And the idea was that we would teach courses across the universities and then organize a conference. And then the principal investigators would put together a book based on are mulling over some of these issues, both in the course of lectures, the conferences, and there's a conference volume called Oceanic Cosmopolitanisms, which is projected. So this book is part of that project. And I'd like to thank Nishad Zaidi, Simi Malhotra, and Sarah Jappi, who have contributed to the volume. There's going to be a separate book launch at Stanford next week, where we will all be engaging with each other. So that's the broader background. What I want to do is to actually speak about 3 things here. The first is that as all of us, as historians, we speak from a location and we speak from a time. So this turn to actually thinking about the ocean seriously, thinking beyond the nation state, thinking beyond the incarceration of identities within the nation state, all of this has come to a head in India with the rise of Hindu majoritarianism and the existence of a Hindu majoritarian government, where the borders that were drawn for us by colonial powers have become the objects of worship, ironically. So the nationalism worships the lines, the arbitrary lines drawn in the dust, the shadow lines, as Amitav Ghosh has called them. And this inheritance of cartography is something that lies at the core of a certain kind of nationalism that we are expected to worship, and which creates people who do not belong. The notion of the citizen, the refugee, the migrant, and so on and so forth. So how do we move away from this terracentric history, which is an inheritance in some sense of colonialism, its cartographies, its land revenue settlements, and its desire to contain people, contain movement, peasantize society, as Christopher Bailey put it. And in one of the consequences of this really has been the emergence of a dominant idea of India stretching from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. It's a history and a geography that refuses to get its feet wet. India ends, as it were, at the ocean. And this is something that one needs to think about very seriously, because all along the coast, histories are far more expansive. The notion of time is far more expansive. So Kerala, where I come from on the southwestern coast, there is the myth of Parashurama, who reclaimed land from the ocean and brought Kerala into existence. And this myth exists along the coast. And in some sense, when one is thinking about the history of the present, the plangent question before us is, how far back do we have to go in order to write a history of the present? And this is something that is really anchors a lot of my thinking about history. And the idea of kingship within Kerala is also of the king who left for Mecca. The last king left for Mecca. So there is this connection of the southwestern coast with larger geographies and oceanic histories. Sumati Ramaswamy's wonderful work, which looks at the idea of Kumarikandam, or the lost Tamil civilization on the southeastern coast, which ties up with larger ideas of Atlantis, lost civilizations, and so on. And it is an adaptation from the idea of Lemuria, which was an idea in the late 19th century. And this is picked up by Tamil revivalists on the southeastern coast. And central to this idea is that civilizations exist, but civilizations can be reclaimed, right? And this is a myth that is profoundly powerful for our the age of the Anthropocene, where we are faced with the fact that cities may just vanish, right? And we'll come back to this. So in as far back as the first millennium of the Christian era, you have the idea of kadal kol, or seizure by the ocean, of entire civilizations being seized by the ocean and being taken away, the hubris of humans being tamed by the waters. And this question is central. So this question of the waters, global warming, Anthropocene, and the question of a land-centered imagination, which is so deeply entrenched in the Hindu nationalist imagination, and to play these off each other. And so when we think about the fact that by 2050, it is projected that cities like Mumbai and Kolkata will be underwater, 31 cities, including Florida and so on, places in the US as well. And the fact that the pattern of winds in the ocean, the pattern of the tsunamis, pattern of typhoons are changing. The 2004 tsunami did not hit Sri Lanka severely, but did not climb up to the southwestern coast. But increasingly, we are seeing storm activity, typhoon activity in the southwest, in the Arabian Sea. And so we're seeing something that actually is a portent of the future in many senses, which requires us to think with the ocean, not merely as something that is at the penumbra of our imagination, but should be central. And the question of where does India end, right? And this was the question asked of the Roman Empire. Where does the Roman Empire end? Where does India end? And as Sudipto has pointed out, Sunil Amrit's wonderful work, which looks at the Bay of Bengal and its continuity with the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia. When we think about the histories that connect the southwest coast of India with Arabia, East Africa, and so on, and the presence of the Christian, the Muslim, and Jewish people within India as a result of the flows of the ocean. So in many senses, this refusal of the ocean, which is central to the nationalist imagination right now, is also the refusal of the non-Hindu, right? It is the creation of India as a terracentric Hindu space. And this is something that, for me, is something that to be fought for, against politically. The second point that I would like to think with is this idea of continuous oceans, which Renisa also speaks about and theorizes in her work. But here the interesting thing that I want to pick up is when we say ocean as method, I'm very aware of the fact that this is something that remains a gesture in a lot of our work, because it's not very clear what this method is. We all work within our disciplinary habits. So we have people like Stefan Helmreich, who might work with the idea of microbes in the ocean, or Melody Jouet's work, where she engages with the ocean through deep sea diving, learning deep sea diving, and so on. Most of us work with texts, archives. We do travel, perhaps. We travel across the ocean, but the engagement with the ocean has not moved us to a conceptual vocabulary which arises from the ocean. So we are left with vague metaphors of flow, circulation, fluidity, and so on and so forth. But as yet, we don't have the kind of conceptual vocabulary that comes to us from terrestrial histories, which are connected with state, with the agrarian rhythms, with community, with self, and so on and so forth. So I think we are still at the edge of something, right? And we still there's a lot of work still that needs to be done. And increasingly, we also realize that these metaphors of flow, circulation, and fluidity are also in some sense conceits, because when you think about the work of Jatin Dua, for example, who examines the notion of stuckedness, of how things congeal on the ocean. You all know that image, that profound image of that ship stuck athwart the Suez Canal, which blocked international trade for a long time. And so I think we need to stop being too literary with our images and to think more in a more grounded fashion. in many senses, I think also this work and all our work kind of militates against this idea of associating oceans with particular histories, the Indian Ocean as a space of indenture, the Atlantic as a space of slavery, the Pacific Ocean again as a space of certain kind of flows of labor from Asia and so on, where one of the examples that I pick up on in my essay is that of the Vartamana Pustakam, the first travelogue written in any Indian language from the 18th century, where you have these two priests set out from the southwest coast of India in order to settle a local dispute. And sheer temerity is what governs their travel. They decide to go meet the Pope to resolve this. And they arrive in Rome after many months via Bahia in Brazil, right? So it's the ocean that determines their travel, their individual desire for a quick, short, sharp visit to the Pope who might bless them doesn't happen. So we really begin to think about connected oceans in this fashion, where oceans determine, in many senses, travel and movement, and much beyond the hubris of individuals who engage with the ocean. And we have a lot of work right now which shows us the connections between African slavery, Gujarati capital, Portuguese trade, so that entire stretch from Malacca to Bahia in Brazil, the oceans are connected through these historical flows, which we can't separate, which we can't segregate. Of course, for heuristic reasons, we might say, look, hey, this is too vast a space. I'll stick to the Indian Ocean. But that we have to realize is something where we are placing checks on ourselves and not engaging with the flow of history. And the wonderful work done by Jeremy Prestwold, for example, which looks at the emergence of early industrialization in Salem, Massachusetts, as well as in Bombay, because of African consumer demand. So that again takes us away from these stories of African lack of agency and puts African consumer agency at the center of a early industrialization. So there's a lot of work of this kind that we need to take into account. And again, to come back to politics and time, I think one of the fundamental things that we need to think about that is that we live in a time when, as I put it in an earlier essay, people are walking on water. So right from the time of Vietnam and Cambodia, the Sri Lankan Tamils, with the civil war in Sri Lanka that produced that diaspora, which propelled Tamils into places as far away as Capri and Toronto, the Rohingyas in South Asia itself, the movement of labor. You think about the Syrians coming across the Mediterranean from 2015, and Ai Weiwei's wonderful documentary and document interviewing 600 people, which showed that of the people who ventured out to the sea, more than 80% didn't know how to swim. Right? And this for me is a startling fact. I'm loath to enter a swimming pool because I can't swim. And here we have this spirit of restlessness, adventure, and so on, which we tend to impute to certain forms of elite travel. And here we have another space of a subaltern engagement with the world, which is very, very different, and with the ocean. I'll stop with two works of art, because in my work, I try to think through works of art, because I think artists have always been much more sensitive. They've been the bellwethers, in many senses, of an emerging imagination. The first is a work by the Albanian artist Adrian Paci, and you can see The Story of a Stone. It's available on YouTube. And it shows you the ship in the middle of the ocean. The ship has set sail from China. It's making its way to Europe. And there are these laborers working with huge blocks of marble, carving, grinding in the terrific heat in the open sea. What they're doing is carving Doric, Ionian, and Corinthian columns, right? These Chinese labor. So in one sense, Europe is being brought across the ocean from China into Europe itself, right? So there is this kind of the question of where is Europe? What are the histories of labor? Brecht's plangent question, who built the pyramids of Thebes? All of these are implied in this. The other work that I'd like to stop with and end with is a work that I constantly go back to again and again. It's a work of this Swiss artist Marie Velarde, who I cite in the essay. Her wonderful work called Atlas des Îles Perdues, the Atlas of Lost Islands, 2107. And it's a room in cerulean blue with drawings and etchings of islands that exist islands that are vanishing and islands that have vanished. So in one room, she summons up the image of the past, present, and future. And when you stand there, you know that these are not just far and distant islands in the Pacific that we're talking about, that Mumbai may be no more, Florida may be no more, and Calcutta may be no more in many senses in the years to come. So thinking with the ocean is a necessity. And I'll stop there. I've come up to 15 minutes. I'd also like to apologize because, as you can see, I'm lit by this sepulchral glow here. It's like a German expressionist film. It's because there is no electricity in my house. I'm working with my iPhone and my laptop. I'm not sure how long it will last. So I must apologize that at some point, if I just vanish, it will be because the light has gone out of my life, to borrow a phrase from somewhere else. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dilip. That was wonderful. And Renisa, I want to jump in.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia is located on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied territories of the Musqueam people. And today I'm zooming in from my home office, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied lands of the Squamish people. And I thank them for their stewardship of the lands and the waters on which I work and reside. So I've been really looking forward to this discussion on the new volume, Ocean as Method by Dilip Menon, Nishat Zaidi, Simi Malhotra, and Sarah Jappi. And I'm very grateful to May and to Sudipta for the invitation to be in conversation with Dilip and Isabel, and to think more about oceanic histories and particularly their relevance to Anthropocene ecologies. I should say at the outset that Isabel's The Complicating Sea, the Indian Oceanist Method has been very inspirational and has really shaped my own thinking on oceans as method. So this event is particularly important for me. So I've organized my comments around Dilip's introduction, Oceanic Histories from the Terrestrial to the Maritime, and we'll focus on three main themes: the significance of the Indian Ocean as a starting point for oceanic methods, the question of temporality, particularly Dilip's efforts to reperiodize globalization, and finally, the materiality of the sea and its subterranean depths. So the last really speaks to some of the points that Dilip just made in his comments about, trying to think in more grounded ways with oceanic methods and with oceans that are not just at the level of the literary. So these strands that emerge with different visibilities in Dilip's introduction also appear in Isabel's work and in my own. And so I'm using Dilip's introduction as an entry point to initiate a wider conversation or discussion on Isabel's Ocean as Method and what I call Oceans as Method. So let me start with the Indian Ocean. Ocean as Method, the book, is a wonderful book that draws attention to the rich polyglot world of the Indian Ocean world. Menon and his collaborators described the book as offering, and I quote, a new way of thinking about the humanities and the social sciences. The book, as they summarize it, explores maritime connections in social and humanistic research and puts forward an alternative to national histories and area studies. But as one reads further, it becomes clear that this is not only a book on Indian Ocean histories. As global warming and rising sea levels ring alarm bells across the world, they write, the chapters in the volume argue that it's time to think through oceans to realign discourses which better understand our future. And as I suggest at the end of my comments, this is what I see to be a key contribution of the volume. What many call the Anthropocene demand new forms of thinking and writing that can hold past, present, and future in tension with one another. Menon and his collaborators draw inspiration from Hofmeyr's Ocean as Method and also my work, thank you for the shout out, which also centers the Indian Ocean region. I'll say more about my own work further on, and I want to just focus on Isabel's work for a few minutes. For Hofmeyr, the Indian Ocean is a complicating sea, as we've already heard, a space of multi-directional movements, both human and literary, and an archive of transnational imagination. Written for a special issue on comparative literature and published in Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East in 2012, Hofmeyr focuses on the Indian Ocean and on Indian Ocean literature to center what she calls the lateral networks of South-South encounters, relations, and histories before and beyond European colonization. And certainly this is a point that comes up quite forcefully in Malhotra's chapter to sort of emphasize why we need to think outside and beyond just the colonial. So this short essay that Isabel wrote in 2020 and was published in 2012, teams with brilliant insights on how foregrounding the Indian Ocean in comparative literature may shift histories of diaspora, slavery, and cultural forms. Exactly a decade later, at a very different historical juncture, Menon and his collaborators expand on the significance of the Indian Ocean as a site of new ways of thinking. Menon's introduction and the chapters that follow move beyond territorial frames of history writing and instead trace connections across the Indian Ocean world. What I found especially compelling about the book is how the editors, all of whom are also contributors, use the Indian Ocean arena to trouble familiar temporalities and periodizations. In the preface, they say, the overall objective of the project was to move beyond a temporality defined by colonialism to look at the longer histories of circulation of people, ideas, and material across the ocean. For example, slavery and indenture, religion and literary cultures, and trade and mercantile migration, respectively. In his introduction, Menon reiterates at the outset when he writes, a maritime vision would require us to engage with the persistent movement of people, goods, and ideas across the ocean, which has always exceeded nation states and empires. So I want to move to, so basically all three of us are really sort of emphasizing the importance of the Indian Ocean as a starting point to think about ocean as method or oceans as method. So now I'd like to move to temporalities. The Indian Ocean has long been a site of multiple temporalities. As I discuss in my book, Across Oceans of Law, the region was central to the making of a Western international legal order, beginning with the writings of Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius and the responses that his work generated from Scottish and English critics. This international order did not only set the groundwork for international law, but also divided the planet into quadrants of east-west, north-south, civilized, savage, divides that would be reinforced and naturalized through latitude and longitude. The quest for longitude from the 18th century onward became a quest for global time. By the 19th century, the invention and imposition of global time through Greenwich Mean Time was determined and shaped through concerns about transoceanic shipping. European ships that were traveling in the service of global capitalism required direction and coordination. Yet, despite the empire of time, other times, including anti-colonial ones, persisted in ways that challenged colonial temporalities and the ambitions of maritime efficiency. These included the monsoon winds, lunar cycles, the times of the spiritual and the sacred. And I should say that I found Zaidie's chapter, Oceanic Encounters with the Other in the Age of Empire, to be fascinating. There she highlights what elite Muslim travelers thought about the vessels they traveled on, while reminding readers that these voyagers provide a planetary perspective where narratives of time, space, and the planetary were often controlled by the forces of nature and not humans and technologies. Ocean as method seeks to move beyond colonial temporalities, yet the temporality that concerns Menon in the preface and in his introduction is how we might reperiodize globalization and the implications this has for climate catastrophe. And so I want to just be clear that I'm not suggesting that globalization is tied solely to European empires or to colonization, but I do wonder what it means for our efforts to reperiodize if we're diminishing the significance of colonialism and colonial temporalities. For many historians, the 19th century was a time of mass migration and a key moment of globalization. But for Menon, the most immediate sense of globalization that we have is that of global warming and the rise of the ocean levels due to the melting of the polar ice caps. Further on, he writes, regardless of where one is located on the globe, the rising waters press on our consciousness, and we're becoming more aware that the biblical prophecy of the fire next time may be a red herring. The sense of an interconnected history, he writes, brings together for the first time the intertwined fates of humans, animals, and other beings on the planet, sentient or otherwise. And while I'm in full agreement with Menon's observations, as a scholar of colonial legal history, I want to really sort of emphasize the significance of, or maybe question how we might reperiodize globalization without attending to the significance of colonial temporalities. After all, Greenwich Mean Time remains the temporal center of the world, and shapes where we are located and the times that we're in today. And if we can think of globalization and climate catastrophe outside of colonial temporalities, how might this erase or diminish the role and responsibilities of European empires, the US empire, and their continued overconsumption in a burning and flooding planet? Climate change, as I've argued recently, demands that we take seriously the movements of European ships and their role in the genocide of indigenous people in the Americas, slavery in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, and in the maritime struggles over commodities, resources, and colonization in the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific. Climate catastrophe has unequal effects and responsibilities, as we're well aware. Rising sea levels in the Indian Ocean, for example, has profoundly reshaped planetary and juridical distinctions between land and sea, which were central to the writings of Grotius, especially in his claims about the maritime and the terrestrial as elementally different. But Menon pushes this argument further when he writes, climate change has resulted in a globalization that has dissolved the conventional distinctions between the first world and the third world and between developed and developing countries. And so I'm going to ask the question again, and it's really a genuine question: can we reperiodize globalization in a way that accounts for climate catastrophe without thinking seriously about European colonization, the role of ships, time, and distance? So I want to just move to the final section of my comments on the materiality of the sea. Anthropogenic climate change has dramatically altered the world's oceans. As Elizabeth Delory argues, the most visible sign of planetary change is sea level rising. In the Indian Ocean region, as we've already heard from people on this panel, waters are warming faster than in other ocean arenas. Increasing temperatures are disrupting familiar weather patterns, affecting sea levels and endangering islands and coastal states. Rising sea levels are also threatening islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. What connects these ocean regions is that all have been spaces of colonial extraction and imperial experimentation. The Indian Ocean arena has been a rich site of scholarship and one that is increasingly concerned with planetary crisis. But ecological thinking demands a different sense of geographical and temporal interdependence, as well as other scales and depths of analysis. In a recent essay, Hofmeyr and Lavery write, the cosmopolitan world of the Indian Ocean has long fascinated scholars and become a vibrant domain of research. Yet this work has had little to say about the sea itself. Its focus on human movement with the ocean as a passive backdrop. In the age of rising sea levels and climate change, it's important to learn about the sea from a material and ecological point of view. Menon is unequivocally clear that in our current time of climate catastrophe, ocean as method has renewed urgency. But the materiality of the sea, which is present in his comments, is not as present in the book as it might have been. Following Hofmeyr and Lavery, I'd like to hear more. I would have liked to have heard more about what is below the waterline, and along the lines of my own thinking of oceans as method, how the Indian Ocean connects the Pacific and Atlantic worlds, not just on the surface, but also what lies below. Ocean as method joins others in arguing that climate catastrophe demands new methods of analysis and inquiry, whereas some have argued that we need new ways of periodizing the Anthropocene, a longer historical arc that moves its origin from the Great Acceleration further back in time to the early 17th century, for example. Others argue that we must not privilege the Atlantic world and must direct attention to Asia and to the Indian Ocean in particular. So what I call oceans as method in Across Oceans of Law follows a ship, the Komagata Maru. And what I've been trying to do sort of since the book is to think about what following the ship as an oceanic method might allow us to see. So all origin stories of the Anthropocene that are currently in circulation that identify 1441, 1492, 1610, 1784, 1950 as origin points of the Anthropocene implicate the moving ship, even if the ship is never visible in these narratives. Following ships, I suggest, allow us to see and think across ostensibly incommensurable times and disconnected spaces. There are many ships we can follow, and for now and in closing, I'll draw attention to the ones that laid telegraph cables at the bottom of the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans, a submarine history that connects humans more than humans, European technology, and colonial violence. A submarine history that connects us today through fiber optics and the internet. The rise of the telegraph points to another moment of climate catastrophe, the interconnections between imperial communications, the extraction of gutta percha, and indigenous labor and life worlds in Southeast Asia. Narratives of the Anthropocene, some claim, privileged the so-called New World and reinscribed the West as the center of history. Although the history of gutta percha has drawn far less attention than the transatlantic slave trade, like the slave trade, this history of extraction and ecological destruction is deeply implicated in climate catastrophe. By the 19th century, gutta percha was a household name in European metropolitan centers, including London. Given its prominence, gutta percha appears as an entry in Hobson Jobson, a glossary of colloquial Anglo-Indian words and phrases compiled by Sir Henry Yule and Arthur Coke Burnell. This is not the name of a tree, they point out. It references a Malay phrase, gutta percha, meaning a white milky sap or latex substance that was extracted from the Palaequium tree, which grows in parts of Southeast Asia. Gutta percha produced a durable and pliable substance that was used in many 19th century domestic items. Both its rise to prominence and its rapid demise coincides with the expansion of the telegraph cable. Gutta percha was used as an insulator for undersea telegraph cables, and as Yule and Burnell describe it, it was collected by first ringing the tree and then felling it, and no doubt by this process, this article will speedily become extinct. The extraction of gutta percha was a highly specialized enterprise that depended on the knowledge and expertise of indigenous collectors. The felling of trees was labor-intensive and highly dangerous, both to indigenous people and to forest ecologies. Indigenous death and ecological destruction were justified through demands for efficient modes of imperial communication. Colonial officials claimed that better technologies would assuage widespread fears of mutiny, rebellion, and other security threats, thereby addressing concerns of imperial vulnerability. In 1851, the first international cable was laid by ship. By 1903, 230,000 nautical miles of submarine telegraph cables had been placed along the ocean floor, connecting oceans to islands and continents and imperial posts to metropolitan centers. Almost all of these submarine lines were insulated with gutta percha. The history of gutta percha offers an example of how colonial and imperial advancements in maritime infrastructure contributed to ecological destruction while historically paving the way for other communication infrastructures, including the internet that connects us now. I draw briefly on this history to insist on the urgency of oceanic methods, not only to trace the movements and circulations of people, literature, legalities, and ideas across the surface, but also to move underneath the waterline in ways that include subterranean depths and ocean methodologies. Despite sea level rising and the growing wateriness of the planet, histories of the Anthropocene continue to be marked by a terracentric bias as well. Centering oceans may offer ways of holding different historical moments in tension with one another in ways that offer other periodizations and signal to the uneven effects and responsibilities of climate catastrophe. Reorienting our thinking along surface lines and subterranean depths may also challenge and ultimately change the way we think of what constitutes the maritime and the divisions between the maritime and the terrestrial. Thank you.
Thank you, Renisa. And finally, Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Sudipto and May for the invitation. And it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with Renisa and Dilip. So firstly, congratulations to Dilip, to Nishat Zaidi, Simi Malhotra, and Sarah Jaffe on this book. And thank you very much for enriching our bookshelves. So we're commenting on your chapter, which draws together this very impressive range of reading with a primary focus on what you call a comparative study of connectivities. And you illuminate in a rich way, and I quote, the lived cosmopolitanism is generated through the movement of people, which constitutes a parallel trajectory to the narratives of empire and nation. And you draw out then, these very interesting and unexpected latitudes and connections that combine different parts of the world that one normally doesn't think together. So I'm struck by the conceptual organization of the chapter, which sort of falls into two parts. So there's the section entitled Art at the End of the World, which raises questions of rising sea levels, multi-species approaches, and Anthropocene methods. Then there's a section which makes up the bulk of the chapter that explores this comparative study of connectivities under the headings continuous ocean, space of relation, and different relations. So the first section raises a question, as I say, of oceanic methods in the age of the Anthropocene. If I can say, a theme also really interestingly explored in Sora Jaffe's very interesting set of interviews. The second section is a largely human-centered history in which the ocean, as Renisa was saying, forms a backdrop and a transport surface. So there's something of a tension between this first section and the second section. The first one goes in one direction, asking us to think about multi-species methods, factoring in the non-human, and a set of artworks that conceptualize inundation. The second moves in another direction and offers a sort of overwhelmingly human-centered history in which the sea is a passive backdrop. So I'm sort of interested that the chapter offers us, it doesn't seem to have a lot on ocean qua ocean, and you addressed some of those issues in your opening comments. But I was wondering, in fact, whether the chapter, in fact, is really about ocean as method, and perhaps it's actually closer to port city as method. So be that as this may, I think this tension between the first section and the second section is, I think, a productive one and one that we all struggle with. And Renisa's comments ended on that note, of how do we think surface and depth together? So how does one align these older surface models of oceanic studies, which are very rich and important, and which overwhelmingly center human movement, with more recent and challenging sets of oceanic approaches, and they're now rich and wonderful sets of methods, whether it's blue humanities, wet ontologies, multi-species approaches, critical ocean studies, immersive methodologies, black hydropoetics, hydrocriticism, hydrocolonialism, amphibious aesthetics, coastal form, etc., etc., etc. So I think at one point in the chapter, you talk about global history and the need to move away from vast abstract schemes to more bite-sized methods. And I wonder whether it was worth thinking about this method in relation to the ocean itself, i.e. thinking about the ocean in more bite-sized chunks. And I say this because I think some of the most interesting new oceanic, critical oceanic studies work is pushing us towards thinking in oceanographic regions, not geopolitical or imperial or a one ocean model, but to actually start grappling seriously with oceanographic, or what would be an oceanographic region. So again, take, for example, a recent article by Elizabeth Delubri, who Renisa mentioned her. She writes a piece with Tatiana Flores entitled Submerged Bodies, the Dialectics of Representability and the Sea in Caribbean Art, which talks about artists sort of working really with the oceanographies of the Caribbean Sea. And the article suggests that the telescoping between a regional or local sea and a broader oceanic imaginary is vital for theorizing the representability of seawater. And it continues, while much of the work in the blue humanities speaks of a shared oceanic experience, the artists engaged here draw from that tradition as well as very specifically historical visions. Okay, so making that point that, we maybe need that sort of change of scale. It's a point also that Sian Lavery makes, and she's of course doing really wonderful work on the deep ocean as well as the Southern Ocean. And she, in her interview with Sarah, says, in general, I think that ignoring the ocean's different environmental structural elements means that you just start to treat places, and therefore in her field, she says in my field, i.e. literature, texts in quite flattening ways. So on a slightly different front, some time back I was reading about the spiritscapes of the ocean and learned this very interesting fact that jinns are particularly keen on the Red Sea. Something I think which makes sense if you start to think, if one looks at the question oceanographically. So it's a semi-enclosed sea with warm temperatures. The Red Sea apparently has these devilish cross winds, high evaporation and hence salinity, odd circulation patterns, flip-flopping monsoons, as well as coral reefs, coral islands, and volcanic outcrops that make navigation difficult even for steamships. So while on this topic of jinns, I of course have suggested elsewhere this concept of creolized water, which I think is a really, I found it useful to think about cosmopolitanism below the waterline. So obviously in any post-colonial context, bodies of water are bustling with metaphysical congregations. In many African societies, rivers and oceans are home to ancestors, water sprites and deities, mermaid-like creatures, and so on and so on. And if one considers what Habiba Badaroon calls the African oceans, we encounter jinns, ancestors, mummy water, the aquafuturism of Drexians, the drowned of the Middle Passage, and as well the drowned of the Indian Ocean systems of enslavement. And you suddenly have this really fascinating submarine cartography that I think offers a way of filling the empty ocean and a rich site for thinking about what you're interested in, which is sort of popular cosmopolitanisms. So returning to this bite-sized theme, I think one important set of approaches would be to think about material, as material as one can, especially about coastal morphology. And I see that Sudipto and May's book, which I haven't had a chance to read, but I'm excited to do so, called Terra Aqua, does this, with its categories of mud, as I can see, and riverbank, and so on and so on. So one fascinating example is that if comes from work being done by Kinaya Hassan, who I see is in the audience with us, and I hope she'll come in. She's a PhD student in history of art at NYU. She's doing really fascinating and amazing work on photography in the Indian Ocean. And she's also interested in mangroves in the Indian Ocean world as a kind of maroon type space, as they were in the Atlantic world. So I was talking to her about her work and was reminded that Durban Harbour long contained a section of mangroves in which Indian indentured labourers had sought refuge, and it was also a place in which many different communities interacted. The so-called Zanzibaris, who were quote-unquote liberated Africans freed by British patrols. There would have been Zulu workers from further north. And so again, that bite-sized material feature of coastal morphology gives you insight into a particular kind of cosmopolitanism. Another, I think, interesting method is that of a kind of harbour floor method, first used by, I think, environmental historians in Sydney, where you look at the artifacts that actually gather or lie on the ocean, on the harbour floor. I obviously couldn't try this in material terms, but I've tried it speculatively, where, you might think about where, what might you find in the sort of decoction of Durban Harbour and its hintersea? So there'd be shipwrecks, collapsed infrastructure, detritus dumped by ships, and port workers, including books thrown into the ocean by customs officials as a form of censorship. But there also would have been these traces of the cosmopolitanicity of the port city itself. There would have been the paraphernalia of Hindu-Muslim religious festivals, and that paraphernalia would have been immersed in the ocean. And they remind us, of course, of the many oceanic imaginaries in any port cities. There would be maritime mythologies of South Asian groups, Zulu speakers, African dock workers, port officials from all over the world. So speculating on and from the Durban harbour floor redefines water itself as cosmopolitan or creolized, containing both the material and imaginative remains of different communities around the port city. Okay. Thinking again from surface to depth, one, I think, space of increasing importance is the seabed. And as the work by Samira Ismail and Surabi Ranganathan indicates, they look at Bandung and decolonization and the impact that this had on international law, and specifically the international law of the sea. And given that your piece mentioned Bandung, this seems to be a sort of interesting kind of way to develop it. And their work, I think, points to the fact that the decolonizing nations and the discussion at Bandung tended generally to promote the territorialization of the ocean, pushing for the creation of offshore exclusive economic zones, while intervening in the international politics of the seabed, attempting to adjudicate claims on its resources and trying to give first world and third world sort of equal their claims, but certainly not rejecting the idea of extractivism in toto. So in conclusion then, I'm recommending this insertion of the vertical along with the horizontal. And of course, this verticality needs to go up as much as down, and you've spoken about typhoons and hurricanes and cyclones, very often usefully thought about as a kind of literary or cultural region, and certainly sort of, makes people who suffer under those systems start to imagining themselves as sharing stuff in common. Okay, so just to conclude, I've done that really irritating thing, which is to say, if I'd written this book, this is what I would have done. So I'm sure you'll bear with me, but I've tried to suggest how one might think about cosmopolitanism in relation to the very materiality of the ocean. And I think there's a lot of stuff out there that can help us. I don't think we're just beginning on this journey. I think we're quite far down the road. And I think in this way, it helps us, all of us to grapple with this very difficult question of how we put together surface and depth. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to everyone. Now, I was thinking that one thing that I would like to do, show you that Terra Aqua is actually going to be on December 2nd, to which I invite her. So we'll show up again and be part of an ongoing. It's going to be an ongoing conversation. Really looking forward to being able.
David, your voice is coming and going.
My voice is coming and going.
Yeah, it's not
Well,
consistent.
let's see.
Maybe
Where is it going? Could be going. I don't know where it's going. I'm not muted.
Yeah, but just
maybe
through the mic, maybe.
Maybe. Okay. Anyway, did you see the screen that I put up?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that was the main thing. And now I think we have time for a Q&A. Would the panelists like to speak first, or shall we just say let's have the hand raising begin, and people can address members of the panel or the general panel group as you wish?
Well, I was thinking perhaps Dilip could have an opportunity to just sort of respond briefly, and then perhaps from there open to the floor.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much, and it's very gracious of you to give me the time, and because I'm also very worried about the fact that the electricity at my end, the batteries at my end, everything is just going to collapse. So briefly to respond, I mean, our conversations with Isabel have been going on for more than a decade, and so I see this as part of an ongoing conversation, and much of what Isabel has to say I have no disagreement with. I think there is a way in which we need to broaden our understanding of how we deal with the ocean, how we deal conceptually with the ocean, and particularly this notion of surface and depth, and how do we engage with the depth of the ocean. The thing about writing an essay is that this essay was written a year ago and then it's published, and by the time it's published, you're already moved on, you've read much more. So in that sense, you may remember on another occasion when we were at another conference like this, I spoke about the fact of the importance of the seabed, the International Seabed Authority, which is actually expanding our notion of the ocean, because Mauritius, which is the one of the smallest smallest islands in the ocean, is now the world's 19th largest country in terms of territory because of the expansion of its underwater seabed. I mean, as it has gained access to the seabed. So there are multiple things that are happening in the world around us. And again, if we think about a wonderful work that's being done on whales and whale song, to bring in, move away from humans and move to the creatures that live in the depth of the ocean, what is very clear is that the waters circulate. I mean, for the whales, there is only one ocean. It's not the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, and so on. And one of the detailed studies that are being done right now are how whales communicate with each other and transfer songs from one ocean to the other, so that the rate of speed at which these whale song travels is, in one of the articles, it compares it to the global phenomenon of the Beatles, the sheer speed at which the whales learn from each other. So I think there are multiple things that we need to think about here, which move away from the human, which engage with the creatures in the sea, and also to think about, as Isabel put it, think about spirits, ancestors, the ways in which one has to look at the ocean in many senses also as a vast graveyard of bodies that have been coerced into travel, and how the memory of these lost bodies then haunts histories along the coast, and not only along the coast, but in the interior. So in one sense, the ocean is present even in the land. So if you think about, for example, the spread of Sufi music, of Qawwali music, you can imagine that in Rajasthan, which is a desert, in Ajmer at the Dargah Sharif, when the Qawwal sings, the Qawwal is actually bringing a sonic scape that is informed by the movement of Sufis across the ocean, the kind of work that Engseng Ho has talked to us about in Graves of Tarim, 500 years of travel. So I think there are multiple themes that one could think about, and I'm only beginning to engage with this, and hopefully over the next year or two, something else will come, which is not the point that, and I'll just address one point and I'll stop here. Renisa is quite right in asking the question, are we diminishing the impact of colonialism? I think not. What I am saying here very clearly and very strongly, that colonialism cannot be the horizon of our thinking, that there is much else besides colonialism. And in one sense, we would be denying ourselves of agency and of the histories of our regions if colonialism became the framework, which is why I always like to use the example of the Truman Show, Jim Carrey trapped in that vast glass bowl, right? There is no outside, but there are multiple histories, multiple movements that happen that exceed colonialism, which is why I try and work with I'm thinking increasingly with the idea of the para-colonial, not the pre-colonial, not the post-colonial, not the colonial, but something that exists alongside the many times, because we are all in some sense unreconstructed Hegelians. We think with one time, the time of colonialism, the time of neoliberalism, the time of nationalism, and there is a concatenation of times and histories that we need to keep in mind. So I'll stop there. And there's much else. I mean, Isabel has raised a huge set of questions there, but I think those are all things that we are productively engaging with in our work. And hopefully we'll have another such. And I look forward to reading your books. Your book, the edited book that Sudipto and May have done, which I haven't got hold of. So I hope you will send me a copy.
Well, May has put into the chat a link to the book, to the Terra Aqua. And
Okay.
so, and I think that maybe we could put that link actually into the website also, if we haven't done that already. And just to, if you want it to be open for the reading public, that would be great.
Yes.
So I just want to remind people, that in the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a reactions button. And within the reactions button, there's a raise your hand. And it's time for people to raise the hands. And as soon as you do, you'll pop up on my screen and I'll be able to call you. And we'll be able to have all the conversation that you want to have. And unless there's a hand raised, I will have to say that I think that part of the story here that I would like to emphasize is, and it keeps coming up, is that the themes here, you could say that there's an oceanic theme, but in the oceanic method, it seems to me that there's an underlying emphasis on the importance of mobility and the difficulty or even the impossibility of containing mobility within the frames of territorial organization that we take for granted, the nation state being one, but there's others, there's also others. So I think there's this idea that there's spaces of mobility that are escaping methodologies that are based upon the enclosure of territoriality. And the only thing I worry about, and I worried with Sunil's book on this actually, was to turn the Bay of Bengal into a territory. In other words, to create it as a bounded space, as opposed to this idea of the Bay of Bengal being a whole collection of, as Isabel says, maybe lots of smaller spaces and bigger spaces that are all interconnected to one another, but also variously separated from one another. I think that the coastline of Kerala the coastal environments of Kerala has an identity that really is different from the Arabian Sea. That there's actually there's a coastal world that goes along, the eastern and the western coast of South Asia that actually is a coastal environment. But it's you could say it's in the ocean, but it's not deep out at sea. It's a local, for example, it's a place of fishing, of small boats that go out and go fishing. Okay, so where does this fit in the geographies that you're dealing with? Well, they're certainly attached to the land because these boats are not going very far from the land, but they're making their living in the sea at the same time. So I think that this question of the different scales of mobility, the local mobilities, the larger mobilities, and the technologies that involved in generating these different spaces of mobility is actually something that you all are talking about, which I think is really great. And I would like to just sort of emphasize that aspect. And now we have Sritama Chatterjee has got her hand up. And so we're going to hear what she has to unmute. I have to ask you to unmute. There you go. Well,
can you hear me all right?
I can.
Okay,
Yes.
Well, thank you for this conversation and listening to a wide array of thinking about oceanic methods. So here's a question that I have for Professor Menon and also to the respondents, which is, some of us have come to Indian Ocean studies as trained in post-colonial theory, like we haven't been trained in methodologies of Indian Ocean studies, so to speak. And, taking into consideration how Indian Ocean studies is becoming a field within itself, how are we thinking of training the next generation of undergraduates and graduate students who are thinking of doing oceanic studies in some form or the other? Like if we are teaching them a course on oceanic methods or ocean as method, what would that method look like for us? It is not simply archival method or it's not simply ethnographic method, but what is that method? So that's more of a speculative question on my end. Thank you.
So who wants to take that one?
Isabel, I mean, you've been teaching this for quite a while. Maybe you have.
Sorry, I've lost I'm working on a screen that I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Sorry, so I'm lost everybody's picture, but if you can hear me, that's fine. I think the thing is, it's a broader question for the humanities in general, and I think it's a question. I think it's a really interesting question that we all have to think about how we make our particular disciplines speak to the Anthropocene. And so, I think and I think that requires a lot of sort of unthinking, because if you look at Melody Dew's work, I find her work really, really useful, because what she does is she makes us aware of all of the land-centered things that we absolutely take for granted without even knowing it. So they're all Cartesian, they assume certain forms of vision, they assume that we see through air, they assume that we bipedal, all of those sorts of things. So that requires, actually, I found it's a very challenging thing to make yourself aware of those and then to think what to do about it. And so her work is really interesting to say also, you know, all of the intellectual technologies that we have are dry technologies. They're all technology of inscription. And what does that do, you know, once you start to think about those, you know, what she's got this wonderful article called Submerging Hitler. You know, what does it mean to take a media theorist like Hitler and then try and place that underwater and see what happens? Yeah, so I think it is, you know, partly there's also an opportunity here because it's sort of very, very wide open, you know, and I think it's very hard, but it also means that, you know, it's a huge, massive area that doesn't particularly belong to anybody. And I find those sorts of areas always very, very, very interesting and rich with possibility.
If I may just say something at this point, I think Shritamar's question also comes from a kind of disciplinary organization within North American academia. I mean, I think one of the important factors that we are trying to stress here is that, you know, we have now something called the Indian Ocean, as if the Indian Ocean exists as a distinct hermetic space. It doesn't leak into other oceans, it's not porous. So what we are actually trying to think about is oceanic histories, right? And then one might actually have a specialization because one obviously needs to engage with multiple languages, multiple archives, and so on. So here is the question of scale that Isabel spoke about, that we might work with particular themes, but we think with the ocean, not with the Indian Ocean alone. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to think with the grain of our being, right? For me, when I do this kind of ocean, I'm interested in literature, I'm interested in art, in music, and in film, and that's the way I think with the ocean. There are others who might want to engage with the colonial archives, other archives, or there might be people like Melody Joe who just jump into the water, learn deep sea diving, right? And so I think we have to think fundamentally about the grain of our being, and there cannot be one method, you know, and that would actually reduce a very exciting conceptual world to the limitations of a syllabus and of a university pedagogy, which is what we must resist at all costs.
And if I could just, I mean, I think at a very sort of basic level, I think the question of oceanic methods really raise or trouble what we think of as archives, right? And, you know, even the water itself, like the sort of chemical composition of the water becomes a kind of archive that, you know, we can read for climate change or, you know, the shipwrecks or what Christina Sharp calls residence time, all of those bodies that are, you know, that remain in various chemical compositions beneath the sea. And so I think at a very, you know, fundamental level, I think thinking oceanically opens a whole set of archives that we don't consider as sort of as carrying historical traces.
I was just going to very briefly say that one of the people that has influenced my thinking is actually the scholar Greg Denning and his idea of floating worlds. I mean, you know, the ocean, the ship is actually in some ways still a sort of residue of the terran sort of preoccupations of Homo sapiens, you know, afloat, and, you know, how social inequities and language can be sort of reconfigured on that deck. And that's the kind of work that, you know, complicates, and this goes back to Isabel's, you know, wonderful idea of not only complicating, you know, taking us outside the parameters of the colonial, but actually complicating the colonial itself as a space which is not bound by its own logic. In other words, taking the colonial, you know, not at face value, but actually talking about how much history it contains. So I'm finishing a book on colonial punishment right now, and one of the things that is just give you just one quick image of how the British started operating hulks off the coast of Madras, Chennai today, but, you know, and how, you know, those hulks with the convicts, the bodies kept being returned, the dead decomposed bodies of the convicts kept washing up on the beach. And then you have the other side of the story, which is that, suddenly the story of the interior of the rural landscape of India and resistance and polygars, suddenly caught and then cast into another unknown history of the Pacific, which is they end up in Penang, or then later end up in Prince of Wales Island in Australia. So we think about that kind of very history that sort of shakes up your geographies, and not only that shakes up your notions of colonial time. Those are the kinds of things where the ocean enters with tremendous force, and actually in some ways demands its own time and space. And we just have to be attentive to those histories. And that's why, that's what I also learned so much from Renisa's sort of, delving into this history of the Kumagatumara. But anyhow, conversations that need to go on. Yeah.
May I just say something at this point? I mean, I was just thinking with Isabel's wonderful idea of what we need to unthink in order to engage with thinking the ocean. And there are a number of metaphors which come to us without saying, right? So for example, David mentioned the idea of mobility. And one of the most compelling cliches and metaphors in mobility is the idea of roots and roots, the dreadful pun. R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S. And the idea there is that of trees as somehow being rooted. The wonderful work that's being done by James Bridle, among others, has shown, particularly in California, where you are, Sudip, that trees move up to 15 kilometers, right? The trees are actually moving in a kind of Tolkien-like scenario to escape from the kind of the damage being done to the ecology. So they migrate from one ecological zone to another over a period of time. And so there's suddenly, one begins to think that when engaging with the Anthropocene, one realizes how little one knows and how set one is in one's habits of thinking. And so to Sritama's question, I think the thing is that there is no template. What do I teach? How do I teach? I don't think there's a template, and that's what's exciting about studying with the ocean and studying with the social sciences in the time of the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, or climate Caucasianism, as Mark Driscoll has put it. And there's a
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah, Dilip, we could just have oops, sorry about the echo. Dilip, we could have just a conference on Kalapani, and which is the great terror of the unknown ocean, at the same time just is defying millions of lives. Yeah.
A very Brahminical concept, Sudipto. Not everybody fears the ocean.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's I think that's just the right moment to sort of close our session. I just want to say that the question Sritama has posed us about ocean as method, I think what we heard today was a number of different approaches and challenges about this kind of work. And I come from the theater arts. I'm a performer, and I should say that I take away from this session just the varieties of epistemologies and methodologies that the ocean opens up for us. And so thank you so much for this really searching session. And again, thank you all participants and David for running the session for all of us.
Are there no other questions?
It seems that we don't have a lot of hands getting raised, that's for sure. But I think that the conversation, the recording is there. We can come back to it. People can go back to it. I'll get a link on the website very soon. And I also think that we're going to be continuing with this conversation when we meet again to discuss Terra Aqua on the 2nd of December. So, and I think that we can follow up in this in a variety of ways. Think, for example, about this question of what the appropriate pedagogy or methodological sort of dimensions of this kind of study, this kind of work are. And maybe we can figure out a way to have a group, some kind of a place where people can combine things, where you can actually, maybe what I'll do is we'll maybe create a link in the website to a Google folder or something where people can put ideas and put texts and put references and citations to
Right.
sort of develop this as a field. This is sort of what we're trying to do in this phase of our Global Asia program, is to actually take fields of study that are somewhere in the somewhere emerging, among the social sciences and the humanities, and create some kind of framework for making them visible as fields of study. And I think that we might even think about this question of the oceanic field is actually maybe something. I do want to also point out that when we designed the history curriculum at NYU Abu Dhabi, it was designed around oceans rather than around landed territories. So this was like 15 years ago. So this is a kind of a field conceptualization that has really been emerging for a while. And I think now it would be a really good time to try to pull it together across some different, because you've got multiple disciplines, you've got different kind of ways of thinking about these kinds of problems, and different methodological and teaching and research kinds of agendas that people will develop. And it'd be nice if we could sort of combine them in some way. So that's going to be something, a little project that I'm going to try to figure out a way to deal with. We have a website we were developing for a platform for adding a lot of these different elements together and creating the visibility of these fields. And we are combining the material. We're putting the material first into these Google folders, and then we have a web developer who's going to put them into a really, really fancy and very visible and very usable research and teaching web platform. So onward and upward with this. I hope to see you all again in early December, and we'll interact a lot between now and then. And thank you very much for this really nice session. I think I should stop the recording, and we will now.
Oh, we suddenly have hands up.